Hi, I'm Nichole Vogelsinger, and today we are going to be working on a trio of cosmos. So this is the hoop that I'm going to be showing you as a sample, and this is the hoop that we're going to be working on together. So this hoop focuses mainly on one stitch, the satin stitch, and mainly on one type of bead, the bugle bead. So I'm going to show you two different methods for working the satin stitch. We're going to work on a padded satin stitch also, so you're going to get lots of practice with satin stitching with this project. And then we're going to add beads, lots and lots of beads. So let's talk about the supplies that you'll need. Here is a supply list. It's included with the pattern. You can just take a screenshot of this, or you can print it out and have it with your pattern. So the first thing you're going to need is fabric. This is a large cut of fabric that I have. It's just a quilting cotton fabric. It was in my stash. I love the color. So pick something that you enjoy working with because you're going to be spending a little bit of time with it and you want to like what you're working with. You're also going to need a piece of felt, which is optional. It's for the padded satin stitch, and we'll get to that later. But just a piece of, this is just a piece of craft felt. If you have wool felt, you can feel free to use that. So that is an optional item. You're going to need embroidery scissors and embroidery needles. Now, the only thing I want to mention with embroidery needles are the needles that you use are going to have to fit through the bugle beads that you're going to use. So these are just two variety packs of needles that I use all the time. And some of these are very thin. You just want to make sure that the thinnest needle you have will fit through the thinnest bugle bead that you have. You're going to need a water-soluble pen or pencil. This is one of my favorite ones. I'll talk more about this. This is just the Clover Mark Be Gone pen. You're going to need another optional thing is an embroidery stand. I use one of these all the time. It's a Nerge embroidery stand. It just allows me to work with both of my hands rather than holding a hoop and embroidering. Completely optional. You don't have to go out and get that. Also, a light source for transferring your pattern. You are going to need school glue, optional glue stick if you're doing the padded satin stitch, and just the white school glue for finishing your hoop. So just like I just use Elmer's glue. And then you're going to need thread. So these are the threads that I used. I'll pull them all out. So first I used, and I have it marked down what I actually used for this project. So this is the size 5 Eleganza Pearl cotton. We have the DMC tapestry wool. This is the DMC cotton redder's mat. And then these are spaghetti and fruity. These are by Wonderfill specialty threads. They're a 12 weight cotton. So this is what I use for the beadwork on my embroidery. And these are what I use just for the embroidery part of the project. And then we're going to need beads. So we're using bugle beads. These are the 3 bugles that I used. And again, when we get to this part of the project, I will talk in more detail about the beads. But these are the Czech seed bead bugles. And these are the Miyuki bugles, which are slightly thinner. And these are the ones that you're going to want to test your needle with. And then we're also going to need seed beads. So I've used 2 of the size 8 Czech seed beads and then a size 10. And again, we'll talk about the different sizes and the variety that you can create with the different types of beads. So that's about it. I think we are ready to get started now. So our first step in getting the pattern to the fabric is the pattern transfer. So I am using, let me turn it on. This is my light board. You don't need one of these. You can also just tape your pattern to a window, and then you would tape your fabric on top of that to transfer it. So no matter what you have, if you have a window, you're good. If you have a light board, you're good. So I just like to double check that my hoop does fit the pattern, and it does. This is a 6-inch hoop that I have. And then I also have a square of fabric. So I had a larger piece of fabric. I didn't go out and purchase this. I used it from my stash. It's just a color I really like and wanted to work with. And if you're going to purchase fabric, you don't need anything more than a fat quarter for this piece. And a fat quarter will definitely be more than enough. You'd have extra to use for something else. So what I like to do is lay my fabric on the pattern, and then I always double check. Now I know I have enough fabric all the way around. If I was working with even a smaller cut of fabric, I would just want to double check that my hoop fits around the fabric. I'm going to want some excess at first. And so once you know you have the hoop, you know you have your fabric and the pattern all set up, the next thing you're going to do is to get something to transfer the pattern. So this is by Clover. It's a Mark Begon pen. It really is my very favorite pen to use for transferring a pattern. I sometimes will use a chalk pen, but this one I find washes away really easily with water if there's any marks that are left. And it also doesn't rub away as I am working on a pattern. So a lot of times when you're doing embroidery, your hand is kind of moving over the marks repeatedly. And sometimes a chalk pen, the longer that you do that, your marks are just gonna brush away. So that's why I like to use this, a water pen. And now we're gonna transfer the pattern. Now this is a smaller pattern. I can hold the whole thing right here in my hands. I don't have to worry about it moving. With a larger pattern, I would definitely tape this down. If I'm taping it to a window or my light board, I would just use washi tape. But because the fabric, it's all very small and compact and there's not tons of details to work with, I'm just laying this fabric here. So you're just gonna pick a section and start tracing it onto your fabric. Now you'll notice as you're looking at this pattern that the stems look a little disconnected. And there's a reason for that, because as we start stitching that and adding the beads all the way around it, you're not even gonna see your full stems. So that's why you don't see them on the pattern. It's the idea of the stems that you are working with right now. So I'm just going to finish transferring this on. You can see that this pen shows up nice on the fabric. That's another thing you do want to keep in mind. Whatever color you use for the marking pen and whatever fabric you use, you want to make sure that there's enough contrast that you can see the pen or the chalk on your fabric. If I was using a darker blue colored fabric, this would not work because my pen marks wouldn't show up. So I'm going to finish this up. Okay, so I have the full pattern transferred now onto my fabric, and then I can hoop this up. Now before you put all of your transfer stuff away, I'm going to be showing you a method of satin stitching that is padded as well as the regular satin stitching. So if you want to do that and you have a piece of white felt or white batting, something that you can kind of see your pattern through. You can see that this is slightly thicker. There's more layers to this felt, and this is just a piece of craft felt that I'm using. I'm not going to see it on my project. I just want something a little thicker. So I'm going to lay it on top of here, and I'm just going to trace out the petals onto this felt. And I'm going to do my best because, again, it is, you can see how compared to the fabric, you can't see the pattern quite as clearly. So I'm just going to hold it nice and firm to the pattern and trace some of these petals onto the felt. Okay, so you see I have my petals here. And again, completely optional part of this. And when we get to it, I will show you what we're going to do with these. We're going to be using these that we traced, but we're also going to be cutting smaller ones out, and we're just going to freehand those without tracing them. So set this aside for now if you're choosing to do this option. And let's get our fabric and our hoop and put everything together so we can start embroidering. Okay, so we have our fabric and hoop. And we're just going to separate the two parts of the hoop and place the back of the hoop behind the fabric and just make little adjustments until you have your hoop where you'd like it, or until you have your pattern where you'd like it in the fabric. You can see this is the one that I have worked up. Some of these are going to go right to the edge, some of the bugle beads, and that's okay. So you just want to make sure you do give yourself a little bit of allowance around the pattern and the hoop. And once you have it where you'd like it, you're just going to start tightening the hoop. And I like to just gently pull the fabric all the way around the edges. You don't want to pull so hard that your pattern is getting out of shape. So I just lightly start pulling it, and I make sure that it's tight enough all the way around. You don't want any wrinkles in your fabric. And so now I'm going to trim. I don't want to work with this much fabric, and I don't recommend it either, because as you're doing your embroidery, this will all just fold over and you're going to get stitches tangled up in it. So I like to give myself about a 2-inch allowance of fabric all the way around. And if you find as you're embroidering that that is still too much, go back and just trim a little bit more off. You just want to make sure that you're not taking so much off that you can't adjust your fabric while you're working. So this really is a good amount of fabric to leave on your hoop as you're working with the embroidery. Okay, so now we need our thread and our needle and embroidery scissors. I'm using a decent amount of thread right now. This is the size 5 Eleganza Pearl cotton. You could also use a stranded thread like a DMC floss. You can use a thicker tapestry wool. I like how when I work with the pearl cotton thread, you can see the stitches have like a twist to them. So it kind of looks decorative when you look at it from a distance. And so I really like using that. So for one of my flowers, I'm going to use this. And for another flower, I'm going to use a thicker thread just so you can see the difference in how this works up. So I've knotted the end, and now I'm going to thread my needle. So now we're going to just pick one of the petals, and we're going to start with that. And I think I'm going to start with this little one right here. So there's 2 ways that you can do a regular satin stitch. I'm just starting from the base of the petal. This is a stitch that I find very relaxing, and it works up very nicely over time. But I find that when I'm teaching this stitch, a lot of people get really stressed out by their satin stitches, because if you've done embroidery before, the one thing I hear is that people can't get the stitches to line up nicely. And so my little trick for doing that is I start with a stitch right here, and then I'm not going to work just next to it yet. I'm going to come up a little bit further, and I'm going to make another stitch going in the same direction. I'm going to keep them all in the same direction as I fill up this petal. And then I'm going to do one more. And depending on the size of your petal or whatever shape you're filling in, you may have more guiding stitches. Okay, so I have my 3 stitches, which has broken this up into 3 smaller sections. So I'm gonna, since I'm at this end, I'm just going to start filling in the stitches in this little section. So when I'm filling a shape, I find that these guiding stitches help me to line up my stitches nice. It keeps them all going in the same direction because you've broken up a larger area into small sections. And it just, I feel like it just makes your stitches look nicer. So I do recommend, if you are a beginner to the satin stitch, try breaking up your area into several smaller sections. And if you need extra sections because you're really nervous about making all of your stitches line up, give yourself an extra section to work with. So you can see I'm making my stitches nice and close to each previous stitch. I'm not going in and out of the same holes, but I'm making sure that they're right next to it. Now, the one thing, I'm going to finish up this little section and tell you another tip for satin stitching. Satin stitching does use up a fair amount of thread, and you can see that as I am stitching it, I'm working from this end to this end, and then when I make my next stitch, I'm coming back down and working to the top. It might seem like a waste of thread to do that, because once you're at the top and you're making straight stitches, you might think, why can't I just make my next stitch right up here and go down? And you can see I'm covering up a lot of the area on the back plus the front with my thread. When I'm stitching this way, now I've gotten myself all confused. I'm going to start at the bottom again in this section. So I'm going from the bottom to the top. If I were to go to the top, I want my stitches to be nice and close. There is the possibility that I'm just going to take my stitch right through that same hole again and undo my stitch. And you don't want to do that because you're just undoing your work then. So this is the way that you can guarantee you're not going to take any stitches out. And it really does, like, you're able to keep the tension of your thread this way. So I know it might seem like you're just wasting a lot of thread by going back and forth this way, but it really does make a difference in your stitches. Part of the satin stitch is keeping your tension. You don't want to make your stitches so tight that you've stretched out your thread and there isn't any puffiness or there isn't any twist to your threads. So you do want to be mindful of your tension. So as I'm bringing each stitch in and out, I'm just lightly pulling it. And then as I start down here again, it's just the normal tension, if that makes any sense. This will make more sense as you actually start stitching it. But these are a few of my keys for making sure that your satin stitch does look smooth. It does become a relaxing stitch to do. And you can see that as I'm working down to this next guiding stitch that I've made, all of my stitches are lined up nicely because I'm just working in a little section and I'm just working to meet those stitches. So I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to fill in this next stitch, and then I'm going to do the same exact thing with each of these petals. I'm going to make my guiding stitches, and then I'm going to satin stitch and fill in all of the petals. Okay, so you see I've finished this one and I've started my guiding stitches and I've filled in one little area. And now my thread is almost at the end. So the way that I handle this now is I will take my needle and thread, run it under a few stitches, And I don't really even need to knot this. As long as I've run it through a few stitches, I'm not pulling super tight. I just want to make sure that my thread isn't going to come undone. And then I can trim it off. And now I'm going to get some new thread and restart it and keep stitching. So I had said there were two methods for doing the satin stitch, and one of them is to do what I showed you before and block off little sections. The other method is just to simply start at one end and work your way to the other. And there aren't really any special tips or tricks that I can give you with that one, other than just keeping your stitches nice and close together, continuing to start like I'm starting all of my stitches at the bottom, working to the top, taking it back to the bottom, and just continuing that way. So here is my finished satin stitch for these two flowers. I wanted to show you what it looks like to stitch. This was the Eleganza, the size 5 pearl cotton right here. And then this one I used the DMC tapestry wool. So you can see it definitely has a more raised appearance. These, again, we're going to go around both of them with the bugle beads. So there's still going to be dimension whether or not you use a tapestry wool or a pearl cotton or a stranded cotton. But I did want to show you one other method for adding dimension to your satin stitch. And so we're going to go back to the pieces that we traced. Now I traced all 3 flowers, but I'm only going to use the padding or the felt for this flower. So I'm just going to move my thread and cut these petals out, and I'm cutting them out on the inside of the blue line because we want them to be slightly smaller than our original shape. So you're going to lay them down on your flower. Now, you want the shapes, the white shapes, to fit inside the lines that you drew on your fabric, the lines of the pattern. So if they're a little too big to fit inside that shape, you can just trim them down, any little parts that overlap. So I'm just going to trim a few of these little spots down. So when I lay these on here, this is going to give the stitch the height of a tapestry wool. And I can tell that just by laying these shapes down. So this is the padded satin stitch that we are going to do. So I am padding this just with one layer. When I look at this, I don't want this to be the one flower that really stands out from this. So I'll show you nice and close. You can see that just putting these felt pieces on, and I can see from being in person, it's the level of the tapestry wool. So when I take my next thread and I stitch over that, it's going to raise these stitches even more and make them look more padded without having to use this very thick tapestry wool. Now another option, which I'm not going to do, but you could layer 2 or 3 layers of the white felt on top of this. Each layer that you put on top of this is going to get progressively smaller. So kind of like a tier, but the top tier will be the smallest layer. And that will help you with your satin stitches. It will make them look padded. So now to get these to stay on the fabric, you could just hold them in place. I could take these all off and just put one at a time on the fabric and stitch over it. But another method is to just glue them down. And so one of the glues, well, I'll show you the 4 glues that you could use. This is just a white school glue, any white school glue. You would put just a tiny little dab, maybe 3 little dabs, and then tap it onto the fabric, let it dry. You could also use a glue stick, which is what I might be using. This is just a purple glue stick, but it dries clear. That doesn't matter because you're not going to see the glue through the thread or the fabric. There's also a fabric fuse, which is a quick adhesive for fabric. You could use that. I do like this because it has a thin point. So for something like this, a tiny piece of fabric, that might work really well. And then this is also the sew line. This is kind of like a glue stick as well. You'll see a lot of like English paper piecers use this. So I have lots of good options. I actually might use that because it is the thinnest. So all you just do is little dab of glue. I probably didn't even need to use that much. You just want it to hold in place while you're stitching over it. So just a tiny little dab. It doesn't need to be loaded up with glue. It just needs to not move around. And then if you want to see what the glue stick looks like, if you're just using a glue stick, I always have tons of these around because of little projects like this. You just kind of do the same exact thing. And then if I were doing multiple layers, I would do the bottom layer first, and then I would take my next layer and put the glue on that, and then my next layer and put the glue on that, and I would just continue until it got whatever height that I wanted it to be for the project that I am doing. So I'm just going to let this dry for a little bit, and then we're going to get to stitching. So the method for stitching the padded satin stitch is exactly the same now. Instead of filling in an empty space though, I am going to be just stitching over the white felt. This is the DMC cotton redders mat that I'm using, which is again slightly thinner than the tapestry wool, but we're going to get our dimension through the padding this time. And now I'm going to stitch these petals the same exact way that I was stitching the other petals. And I'm just going to make sure that each of my stitches, when I get to the white felt, go over the felt. So now I've arrived at the felt section, and I'm just going to make sure that my first few stitches definitely go right on top of that. I'm not going to pull them super tight. I'm keeping the same tension that I was keeping before when I was doing my satin stitching. And I'm just going to keep stitching over this. You can see that it's already giving it a nice padded appearance. Okay, so you can see there is one petal of my Cosmo flower. I still have some threads that I got caught from behind that I'm just gonna have to make sure, there we go, they don't come through the other side. There's still one thread left. I'll take care of that. So that's what it looks like to have the raised petal. You can see it's about the height of the tapestry wool. I could go higher if I want again, but I have a lot of bugle beads that I'm going to be adding to the outside of the petals. And so I wanted it to be a noticeable difference, but not overwhelm the size of the bugle beads. So for this project, just one layer of padding will be perfect. Here is my trio of cosmos all stitched up with the satin stitch. So you can see this is the regular pearl cotton, the tapestry wool, and then the padded satin stitch. And I used a variety of 3 colors. You can choose whatever colors you want. In this original sample, I used all white, and I just switched up the color of beads. So have fun with playing with your colors. So now that we have the satin stitching all done, we are ready to work on the bugle beads. And so I'm going to attach my hoop. I'm just going to hook it into, this is a Nichole embroidery hoop stand, which is super helpful when you need a third hand, which is what I'm going to need as I do this next part. So this is the bugle bead border that we're working on. I want to show you nice and close. So the bugle beads are standing up, and on top of each bugle bead is a seed bead. So now I'm using different types of bugle beads. So I have the Miyuki bugles here, and then I also have, let's see, the Czech seed bead bugles. So these are a little bit thinner than the regular Czech seed bead bugles. So the one thing to keep in mind as you are working with bugles is you need your needle to pass through the bugle twice. It's going to be going through the first time. We're going to put a seed bead on top, and then it has to go through the bugle one more time to secure it in place. So with the Miyuki bugles, they're slightly thinner, and so you just want to make sure, this is my super bent, this is my trusty needle. I use it for any time I have a really thin seed bead or a thin bugle bead. I can't use just a beading needle because I have to have it go through fabric, and sometimes the beading needles are just a little bit too thin. So as you're working on this, the needle is going to be important. And if you can't find a thin enough needle, then just move up to the standard size Czech seed bead, and a fairly thin needle will work just fine on those. So I'm going to be using my super thin bent needle for the Miyuki bugles, and we are going to start off with those. So if you look at this example, you can see that these petals, the bugle beads, are really straight. They aren't these over here have like a tilt to them. They lean back a little bit, and these are standing like taller. They don't have as much of an angle to them. That all depends on how you hold your project as you're stitching it. So for these beads, I was working on the spot closest to me, and when you work the line that's closest to you, they are going to stand taller than if I worked the back part first, and it kind of results in it angling away from you. So I hope that makes sense, and you might notice it as you work on it. I'm going to start with the white Cosmo, and I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to grab my seed beads, and I need some of, let's see, we're going to use some of these. These are the size 8 Czech seed beads. And I'm just going to be using the same size in various colors throughout this project. So I'm just working on my white one. So I have the shimmery clear, let's see, these are the white pearl. And then these are just the white seed beads. So that's what I'm going to be using on this white flower. And so I'm going to work on the flower closest to me, the edge closest to me. And I'm just going to be outlining the flower now, the petal. So I'm going to bring my needle up and thread up. And I didn't even mention, for this particular part of the process, I am using a 12 weight cotton thread. It's very thin. It's a lot thinner than the Eleganza and the tapestry wool that we were using before. So you just want a nice thin thread. It can match your project or it doesn't have to. You can choose a contrasting thread if you want. So I have one bugle, and then I'm going to top it with a seed bead. And then I'm just going to push it into place. And then once it's in place, I'm taking my needle. I can kind of push the seed bead up a little bit. And I'm going to take my needle and just go down through the bugle bead. And when you have a long strand of thread, you just have to be careful that your thread doesn't tangle. And then I kind of hold the seed bead in place as it brings it all the way down. And so there is my first bugle of the border. Now I'm bringing my needle up nice and close, and I'll show it to you from the side, nice and close to where that bugle bead is already sitting. And so each time I bring my needle up and add a new bugle and seed bead, you want your needle to be nice and close to the previous bugle. So I'm just going to put another one on my needle. And you can just kind of hold the seed bead to the side as you take your needle back down into the bugle bead. So again, tension with thread, you want to keep an eye on that. I'm pulling my thread fairly tight so that these beads stand up. You're going to see once you get a lot of them, they kind of just all nestle together and they do their own thing. And because I'm working the side closest to me, these are standing up. There's not much of an angle to them. For some of these outer flowers, outer petals, I chose to work it in the opposite direction so that they would have kind of an angle to them. And again, that's something that you're going to notice more as you work your way through this project. And you can experiment with trying it different ways to see what you like best for your project. It's not a super noticeable difference. So if you are comfortable working one way and holding your hoop one way, go for it. Nobody is going to look at my project and say, oh, I can tell these beads were angled in a different way than the other beads. That's not what people are going to be looking at. So you just want to be happy with your project. And any way that you choose to do it is the right way. So be happy with that. So I'm just going to continue working all the way around here. When you get to parts of the petal where the flowers kind of intersect or they kind of meet up with the other petals, you can choose what line to follow. So when I work my way all the way around this petal, and I'll show you on the finished sample, I worked my way around this petal, but then you can see the white beads and the beads from this other petal. There wasn't enough room to add a full outline to each flower, and that's okay because you do want it to look like your petals are overlapping. And so you can just choose, as I'm working my way through here, because I'm working on this petal first, I'm going to go probably about to this point, and then I'm going to start the next petal and work my way around. And so there's lots of beads going on, and you're going to be able to just kind of blend the petals and the beads together. I just wanted to show you the side angle of what it looks like as you are stringing your beads. You can see they're starting to make a nice little border around the petals, which is pretty cool. And you can see that as I'm putting the bead in place, I'm holding on to the seed bead at the top, and I'm keeping the tension in my thread because that also is key to making sure that your rows, your border rows, stand up nice and tall around your satin stitching. You can see that my needle is coming up really close to the previous bead, the previous bugle bead. So they really are lined up right next to each other, like you're building a little wall of beads around your satin stitching. And then when you get to the end of your thread, what I didn't mention before, so I still have a tiny bit of thread to go, but it's enough that I want to restring my needle. So I am just going to run my needle and thread under the last few stitches and tie a little knot. With the satin stitching, I didn't tie a knot as I was tying off my thread, and that's because there weren't any beads. But whenever I have beads that I'm working with, I like to just tie a little knot to secure the beads and make sure that they're really on there good. You can see here's what the back of my work looks like, and so far here's what the front of it looks like. And there it is from the side. So it's looking really cool. I'm going to keep going with this. So my bugle bead border is completely finished. You can see for the dark blue and the white flower, I used the size 8 seed beads on top. And then for the light blue flower, I used the size 10 seed beads on top. So you can just see like it adds a little bit of variety to switch up the size of your beads. And as far as how many beads you'll need to actually stitch this. So for this sample, I used all, my bugle beads were all the Czech bugle beads, and I went through a lot. I'd say if you're using the same color for all 3 flowers, definitely have probably 2 tubes of seed beads, because I think I used 1.5 tubes of the bugle beads. For seed beads, I had plenty with just 1 tube. So just give yourself a little bit extra to play with if you are choosing all the same color. With each of these, because the Miyuki beads are a lot thinner, I think you could also probably use 1 tube for all 3 flowers, because you can see this is how much I have left, or this is how much I used from just 1 flower. So you could definitely stretch 1 tube of these further than you could stretch 1 tube of just the Czech seed beads, because these are a little bit fatter. The upside is they're a tiny bit easier to work with when you're stitching, so you just have to weigh what you want to do, and a variety is nice. It's nice to include a variety of beads. So now we're going to be working on the raised center portion of our flower. You can see here we have the yellow centers. So for this, I'm using the size 8 Czech seed beads, and I'm also just using a 12 weight cotton thread, just like for all the rest of the beading that I've done. I'm just picking a color that coordinates with my beads. So we're going to start with the largest flower, and kind of like the satin stitching, I start with the center of the flower. So I'm just bringing my needle up, and then I'm going to put, I think it's 5 beads, but we can measure it on my needle. Okay, so I have 5 beads. Yes, I'm definitely going to need more. So the way to measure how many beads you're going to need is you're just going to hold this down against your fabric as best as you can, because there's, again, a lot of dimension going on here. You want your beaded section to be just a tiny bit longer than the actual section we're filling, because we want it maybe a bead length longer. So for this section here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 beads. And I'm going to take my needle down through the fabric just at the very end of that section that we're filling. So because I have 1 extra bead, it's just going to raise it off of the fabric a very tiny bit. So now that was my biggest part of the section that I'm filling, so I know that for this one I'll probably need 7 beads. And again, I can just lay it down and measure it before I actually take my needle and thread through. Yep, that works. So now I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to do one more on this side, probably of 6 beads. And then I think I'm going to need one more at the very end here. This is the tricky part because you do have a lot going on. And I think this one is just going to need to be maybe 3 beads because it's just this little section on the side. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here, just filling this up. And then one more at the very end here. So I've filled this section in with just 1 layer of beads, which looks very nice, and you could stop there. But because we have so much other dimension going on here, we want to give it just a little bit more. You can see here, this is just a little bit more raised. So we're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to go on top of these stitches and just kind of vary our rows a little bit. We're just gonna like stagger them. So I'm gonna do the same. I'm gonna try probably 6 beads. I'm not making these sections quite as long, and I'm gonna be taking them down in between a row of beads. I think I'm gonna put 1 more bead on there. So I'm just kind of like nestling this new row right on top of my other row of beads. If we can do it without getting it tangled in the other beads. And you can see already it's getting a nice puffy look. And so each of these centers is going to have 2 layers of beads on top. And you're just basically staggering your little rows. And as you pull it like a little bit tighter, you'll notice that they all just kind of nestle in there even more, giving it a nice stacked appearance. And then 1 more row in here. So you can see now this, I'll take it out of my hoop stand, that has a very dimensional appearance. And if you want more dimension, go back through and add another line of beads, nestle that in there until you're happy with how much dimension and how full the centers look. So I'm going to finish those other 2 centers. Then we're going to work with some bugle beads to create the centers of the stem. So we've finished the centers, and now we're going to work on the little bit of the stem before the actual like stem of the plant. And we're going to be using bugle beads for the rest of this project. So I'm just using this tube of green Czech seed beads, and I'm using again a 12 weight thread in a color that matches with my seed beads. So I'm going to be bringing my needle up at the base of the yellow and putting a seed bugle bead. Sorry, we're going to be bringing up the thread at the base of the yellow and then putting a bugle bead on our thread. Now you can see it extends beyond this just a little bit, beyond the pattern. Totally fine. The pattern is there so that we can judge where everything should go, but some beads are longer. We filled a little bit more of the section, so that's completely fine. So we have one bead that's coming straight down, and now we're going to angle our other bead. Try not to go through other beads. Once we get to this point, there's so much going on that it's easy to just get tangled in what you are working on. So then I'm bringing this bead kind of at an angle. And then I'm going to do that over here too. So I'm bringing my needle up at the base of the yellow and working down towards the stem. I'm going to put another one on. And again, you can lay this bead down before stitching it on to just gauge where it's going to fall on your pattern. So there are 3. In my sample for this one, I did 4. So however it works out for your pattern, I kind of like how the 3 works right now. So I'm just going to leave that as is. I could always go back and add another one, but I feel like for this, it looks right. So now I'm going to be working sideways with my bugle beads, which they kind of remind me of satin stitching. I think that bugle beads are the satin stitching of the bead world. So we're just going to be making what looks like a satin stitch, but with our bugle beads. And so pick a side to come up, and it is going to extend a little bit beyond the stem that you have on there for your pattern, and place a bead on your needle, and then we're going to just lay it down on the fabric. We want this to be laying flat. And so we're going to take our needle down at the end of the bugle once it's in place, and that keeps it flat on your fabric. So then I'm going to bring this one up again. The bugles are all very close in size, but they can be off a little bit. So that's why you just want to lay it down and make sure that your needle is coming down right at the end of that bead to make it lay flat. And so you're just going to be following the line of your pattern at this point, whichever side of the pattern. Like I'm choosing to start all of my stitches on the left side of the stem. And so you're just going to follow the curve of the pattern. And then take your needle down. So I'm going to continue this for each of the stems and each of the little base of the stem throughout my project. So here we are, all stitched up. This trio of cosmos is absolutely beautiful. You've had lots of practice with the satin stitch in both thread and beads. Lots of practice with bugle beads, laying them flat and also stacking them. And you've created a beautiful piece with lots of dimension. So now I'm going to finish up this hoop like I finish up most of my other hoops. We are just going to pull, gently pull, all of the edges of your fabric. As you're stitching, your fabric is just, it naturally loosens in the hoop. And so before I do anything else, I just tighten the fabric one more time. Tighten the hoop. And then we're going to trim the fabric down. So I'm just going to grab my fabric scissors and I am going to trim, leaving about a ½ inch of fabric. You want to be able to fold your fabric over the back without having it touch the fabric of your project. So I can eyeball this right now and know that I'm cutting off the right amount just because I've done this lots and lots of times. As you are doing it, if it's your first time, just give yourself a little bit of excess and fold it over, see where you are at, trim a little bit more off. You can always take more off, but you can't put more back on once it's been cut. And you do want enough that you can fold it over. And now I'm going to grab my school glue. And we're just going to run a strip of glue all the way around the back of the hoop. I like finishing my hoops this way. I don't have to worry about a hot glue gun burning my hand. I don't have to worry about leaving lots of excess fabric to stitch it in place. And it also allows me to see the hoop guts right here of my hoop, which I am proud of because I worked a very long time to get those hoop guts. I think they're really pretty. I think that the back of the hoop can be just as cool as the front of the hoop. And so now I'm just going to fold my fabric over, press it in place as I'm folding it, and I'm going to let this dry. It doesn't take a long time to dry, but if you're going to be hanging it on a wall, you'd want to make sure that it's really, really dry before you put it up against a painted or a wallpapered wall. So just give it a nice amount of time to make sure it's fully dry before displaying it. And then you can go around one more time, just make sure all the edges are pressed down. And I'm going to let this dry. When your hoop is nice and dry, you can either display it this way, you can set it on a shelf. I like to cut a small piece of ribbon, and this is just ribbon. I'm always collecting little bits of ribbon. If something's on sale at the store, I pick it up if I like it. I'm always looking through antique stores and thrift stores for cool ribbons and trims. So if you're a crafter, you probably already have stuff like this in your stash. So what I do is just bring it through the hoop, tie a little knot, and then you can hang it on a wall by the trim. So just like that, and then just a small knot. And then you can trim the ends. I like how ribbon does get naturally frayed. So when it frays up top, I kind of like that. And there you have it. That is our trio of cosmos where you practiced the satin stitching a lot and worked with bugle beads a lot. I hope you enjoyed this project. I hope it inspires you to add beads to your embroidery and embroidery to your beads. Happy stitching!